Queen Elizabeth II's fashion archive is one of the largest and most important in the royal collection. It shows many aspects of the way she dressed throughout her long reign and her long life. The Queen's style was recognised around the world, largely because she wore British fashion on the global stage. And one of the most intriguing and interesting aspects is her use of diplomacy in dress. And we see this throughout her reign, particularly on the many tours she undertook across the world to Commonwealth and to other countries, where she used fashion as a diplomatic tool. In this film, we're going to look at 3 examples from throughout the Queen's reign, which show us how she used fashion and how she collaborated with the couturiers who worked for her over many years to wear outfits which were diplomatically appropriate, but also contain interesting messages. Using clothing as a diplomatic tool, particularly in royal fashion history, is nothing new. If we think back to the reign, for example, of Queen Elizabeth I, she wore great robes of state, embroidered or embellished with symbols and emblems which meant something to the people around her. And in the 19th century, Queen Victoria used her consumption and support of British fashion and British textile manufacturers, such as the production of Spitalfields silk, to communicate with the audience around her. So it's not a new thing, and yet Queen Elizabeth II really turned it into an art form during her reign, and in collaboration with the designers that she worked with. A huge amount of planning and preparation would go into the production of a tour wardrobe for Her Majesty's travels. And this would include thinking about all sorts of different elements, both colours or embroidery motifs that would speak to that nation and to those people, but also considering the climate and the events and programme to be undertaken. And the Queen was hugely involved in the production of these wardrobes with her couturiers. So here we have a really beautiful example of Norman Hartnell's couture designed for Queen Elizabeth II to wear on her extensive tour of India, Pakistan and Nepal, which she undertook with the Duke of Edinburgh in 1961. And this tour required a very large wardrobe of clothes, which was mainly supplied by Norman Hartnell. And what's wonderful in the archive is that we have the surviving sketches, including for pieces which no longer survive in the collection. So this dress was worn for a state dinner with the President of India. And considerations around climate and around the appropriate nature of materials for a particular occasion was so key to producing a successful wardrobe for the Queen to wear. And when we first see this dress, we think, gosh, it's really heavily embroidered and it must be quite a heavy piece. But actually, it's incredibly light, in spite of this huge amount of embellishment, because it's made of very, very fine silk tulle, which is like a net. It's lined in silk, but then it's completely covered with this beautiful sparkling crystal and pearlized embroidery with all different materials. We have pearl beads, we have diamantes, crystals, little bugle beads, and all of that made up into this wonderful, elegant embroidery scheme which covers every single surface of the dress and the jacket. So let's look a little bit at the detail. There are subtle messages in here. Not only is this an absolutely signature piece by Hartnell with his wonderful embroideries, but these embroideries have a meaning. First of all, they're carried out in this style with this swirling foliate and flower motifs, which is very reminiscent of India embroidery, a particular technique called Zardozi. And so again, that's really paying a nod to the nation that the Queen was visiting. But secondly, and we see this particularly here in the centre of the bodice, so front and centre, the flowers are actually lotus flowers, the national flower of India. And so immediately on seeing this dress and looking at the detail, it would have been obvious to those around the Queen that this was really a reference to the national heritage of that country. What's rather interesting about this dress, apart from its symbolism, is that it was altered for the Queen after she wore it in India. Originally, the dress had a long and very flowing cape-like element at the back, but later the Queen decided to alter this, and Hartnell removed the cape and created this short bolero jacket, which meant that the Queen could wear it on multiple later occasions. The Queen's relationship with Norman Hartnell spanned multiple decades until Hartnell's death in 1979. He was adept at tailoring, but really his great love was to create these beautiful and elegant gowns, and I think this is one of the most beautiful examples from the period of the 1960s. Moving from something which is a signature design really by Hartnell for Queen Elizabeth II in the early part of the 1960s, we can see something which is a great contrast here, but also designed by Norman Hartnell. Here we have this wonderfully striking combination of ivory and deep blue silk zibeline, this wonderful, slightly textured fabric. We know from a surviving sketch that the design for the dress underwent several transitions. First of all, the dress was designed to have a cape, but it appears that the Queen decided she didn't want to have the cape, and therefore she selected the dress itself. But what we also know is that this dress was first of all proposed for a tour of South America a little earlier than the occasion on which it was eventually worn. However, the design was adapted, and the floral embroidery, which was originally proposed, was actually replaced with these wonderful maple leaves, which tumble around the waistline and down the back of the dress, and are preceded by these beautiful crystals and bugle beads here, which help to make the transition between the two very differing fabrics. The maple leaf, of course, tells us immediately that this dress was worn by Queen Elizabeth II in Canada, and she wore it on a very important occasion. It was the centennial celebrations of the Confederation of Canada in 1967, and the Queen famously stood outside the Parliament building in Ottawa wearing this exact dress. So moving from something from the late 1960s, we see a very different silhouette in this particular evening dress here. This evening dress was designed by Hardy Amies, who began working for the Queen in 1951 when she was still Princess Elizabeth. And here we see something from a different decade. This is perhaps quite recognisably from the 1970s, with the very relaxed shape and also the softer fabrics, this wonderful silk chiffon, and just overall a completely different look. Queen Elizabeth II originally had this dress to wear on a tour of Canada in 1977, her Silver Jubilee year, but she chose to re-wear it for a tour of the Middle East in 1979, specifically for a state dinner held in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. And I think the decision really was based on the fact that this is an entirely appropriate piece to wear, first of all, in a hot country. The light fabrics, of course, very much lend themselves to that type of climate, but also because it's a very covered dress, and therefore it meets the social and religious conventions required for women dressing in that environment. Hardy Amies was particularly interested and known for his signature tailoring. This was his great skill as a couturier. So the shape, the line and the cut of his clothes was what really mattered to him, much less so than embellishment, so therefore providing a great contrast with the work of Norman Hartnell. So that's exactly what we see in this piece here. It's all about the tailoring, the draping, the cut, the way that this dress is put together, the gentle gathering at the front, but then this restrained embellishment with these seed pearls, sequins and little diamantes that just add that extra amount of elegance and glamour to the piece. As well as the soft tailoring of this dress, what we obviously see immediately is an incredibly bright colour. And we know that Queen Elizabeth II used colour in her wardrobe extensively, almost inventing the concept of colour blocking, particularly in her day wear. But here we see a bright, vivid yellow, which would have been perfect for such an occasion when she's surrounded by so many people. And this enabled both her to be seen by those people and to stand out amongst the immediate surroundings. These three pieces are just a few examples from an extensive wardrobe of clothing belonging to Queen Elizabeth II. But what they help us to understand is how Her late Majesty used fashion on the global stage as a diplomatic tool to help her carry out her duties.